Hello and welcome to the Nitty Gritty Writing Podcast. I'm Simon Cantan.
And I'm Dave Higgins.
And this week we're going to be talking about what makes a character interesting. But before we do that, we're going to do our usual weekly roundup. And Dave, you can go first.
Okay. Well, it's been a couple of weeks since I was on. So I've done 2 weeks worth of writing and publishing 7 Stones. I've created the advanced review copies of Origin, the first book in Dragons and Magic, so they'll be ready to go soon. What else have I done? I actually, because I wasn't appearing on the Nitty Gritty Writing Podcast, had time to listen to my favorite writing podcast, the Nitty Gritty Writing Podcast. So listened to that. It was awesome. I recommend, if you are listening to it, you continue to do so. And what else have I done? I think that's it. Did I already finished my last pass through adventure?
I can't remember.
Yeah, I've also finished going through the last tweaks to adventure, so there's just a little bit of a final polish the commas type thing on that, and then that'll be good to go. So that's me.
Cool. Mine is going to be fairly short this week because I didn't do very much. I didn't do any writing. I've just been working on my writing app. So yeah, not much to say there. Because I haven't made a full-fledged app before, or website or whatever, I made some fundamental mistakes with how I was setting it up. So then I had to do loads and loads of work, which had no added benefit other than making it more structured and easier to maintain and stuff. One of the major things was that so you press on an author's name and you get all of their books come up in little thumbnails, like a Netflix thing. And then that was taking 13 seconds to load. 13 seconds is quite long. And that's because I was saving the images in the wrong place. So now I'm saving the images in the right place. It takes about a second to load like 40 books.
Yay!
So that was a week's worth of work and no writing at all. That's pretty much that. So we'll go on to our topic. So what makes a character interesting? Dave, you said we should talk about this. So do you have thoughts on the topic?
I do. My first thing is possibly surprisingly not being too deliberately interesting. There's great fun to be had in inventing utterly random characters that are really different, defined by some really unusual trait that makes them exciting to think about. But that's where the problem comes. They're defined by it. For a character to be interesting for me, I want to actually be able to enjoy the way that character interacts with the world, rather than just the way that character interacts with a specific interesting thing. So for me, they have to be a rounded person first and have something unusual about them second. We didn't say they need to be created that way, but once it actually gets to the final draft, I don't want someone who's just an exceptional shot with the longbow, so good they can trim the wings off a fly without the fly noticing. And that's what they are, because then they become one-dimensional. It's like, well, when this character isn't actually shooting a longbow in a situation that advances the plot, why do I care?
Yeah, it's the difference between Katniss Everdeen and Hawkeye from the Avengers. So Katniss Everdeen is not just a good archer, she's also lots of other things. Hawkeye is essentially just a guy who shoots a bow and happens to be in the background.
You get it a lot in superheroes when in the comic books, some of them were pitched, and it was all about pow zap back in the start. So they were very one-dimensional, and people released comic books that lasted for a couple of episodes to try and buy into well, what if Superman was African American and he wore a green cape? And then when it comes to rebooting things, and Hawkeye is probably more nuanced than just he shoots a bow. But all I can remember about him is that he's got a whole lot of different arrows. And I think there's a rotatey thing in one of the films that he's got on his bow or on his quiver that picks arrows for him or something. Yeah, I can't really know anything about him. Whereas if you talk about Tony Stark as Iron Man, there's a lot to him. He's a drunken millionaire who invented the Iron Man suit, and he's got all of these other things. And so that bleeds through into other things. I think vague recollection that Hawkeye is in a relationship with another superhero. I can't remember who, and I don't really care. Whereas Tony Stark having a relationship I care about, despite the fact it's got nothing to do with superheroism. It's just he's an interesting character, and he's a superhero. So the first thing is rounded character. The second thing is a bit of grit between them and the world. You get a character who's too similar to the world. They can be well-rounded, but there isn't that conflict. And I see this in sort of some of the less great pulp fiction, where you get sort of they are a rounded character, but they fit the world. So there isn't a challenge in any of the ways that they interact. They're always interacting from a position of strength, as it were, which means the character in another situation might be interesting, but they're not interesting in the world they're in. So for me, interesting characters and interesting worlds and interesting plot kind of splurge at the edges, where there's some reason why this character is going to do something I'm interested in, rather than go down to the corner shop, buy a pint of milk and walk home. And it's like, well, that wasn't very interesting.
Well, I think they can be at ease in their world as long as there's something that makes them then have to question the entire characteristics of the world. Like I was thinking Rick in Casablanca. So he's perfectly at ease in his world of corruption and backhanders and all that kind of stuff until I forget what her name is, but until his ex-girlfriend turns up, and then he realizes that she's going to be crushed by the same world that he's completely at ease in and has to move outside it in order to deal with that. I think that you're right that they have to be in conflict with the world, but the best films are the ones where they realize something about their own world or their own beliefs that then challenges them and they have to change. I was going to say that the most important thing for me is consistency in characters. If a character knows something, or say a character is very brave, you can't then have them run away screaming. If a character is, so The Walking Dead is the example I use quite often, is I gave up in whatever season it was because they've been out in the zombie apocalypse for 2 years and they're still turning their backs on zombies and having heated discussions with the other humans And you're like, no, deal with the zombies first and then have your heated discussion. You've been out with zombies for 2 years and almost died over and over and over and over.
Yeah.
You would not make those mistakes anymore. And the show is just doing them to have added tension and added excitement, whatever. And consistency, for me at least, is far more important than excitement. If a character is consistent, then I'll forgive there not being the plot being slow or whatever. There should not be, like, I was watching a movie, the start of a movie last night, where there's these guys attacking this wagon, and the start of their attack, they shoot the wife. They're attacking a wagon with a husband and wife and 2 kids. They shoot the wife with a bow and arrow, and then they run in with their axes to attack the husband, who has his own axe. No, they wouldn't. They just shoot the husband as well. They have a bow and arrow. Yeah. Why would you risk your life running at the husband? You just shoot him with a bow and arrow, and then you're done. You have the cart. And that's, characters have to be believable as being smart enough to, like, it's not convenient. Like, if they'd shot the husband, they'd shot the wife, shot the husband, then there wouldn't have been an axe battle in this movie. But I wouldn't have turned it off, because I would have gone, oh, well, at least it's consistent. And it's, for me personally, I'd rather people sacrifice action scenes in order that the characters make sense, or come up with a clever way. Say that the guy has leather armor on that's hardened and boiled and the arrows won't go through it or something. You can have your axe battle. You just have to come up with a realistic reason for it.
Yeah.
So yeah, that often is why I'll turn off a TV show or a movie.
That's possibly that abuts or bleeds into one of the other things that makes a character interesting for me. The right balance of predictability and surprise is general. There are a few stories that I'll read over and over again because I like them, but usually I read a story not wanting to know how it ends, and knowing how it ends makes it feel weaker for me. So I want to feel the character facing challenges without knowing whether they're going to succeed, how they're going to succeed, what effect it's going to have. So I want some surprise, but I want, and this is particularly important in thrillers and mysteries, to be able to play guess what's going to happen next. So it's okay for me if the character does things in a different way sometimes because they haven't thought of something, or because they've thought of something that I haven't. But I want to be able to have a reasonable certainty of going, well, they've got 3 things they could do at this point, or there are 4 things that are going to happen. And get some feel for them. So it's, for me, there's part of that. Is this how I'd deal with it? So there has to be the right level of information for me to see the character dealing with the problem I think they're dealing with. I've mentioned this with Sherlock Holmes stories before, that I find Sherlock Holmes stories very irritating sometimes, because Holmes will suddenly go, and of course, as everyone apart from me missed, the mud was red. And there was a smear of red mud on this doorstep that I noticed 2 days earlier in a different location. So clearly this person is the murderer. You're going, well, logically that makes sense, but you're not a very interesting character because everything's happened somewhere I can't see it. I can't get that thrill of predicting your behavior. So you've wandered around, you've seen things. You are brilliant. Potentially, if I had the evidence, I wouldn't have got it. So potentially you're a better detective than I am, but that's a bit of a boring character because they're doing important things off screen, as it were. So it's not just that they're not consistent, it's that I don't have that ability to walk along with them. And I think a wider point of that is also that the character's frame of reference has to have a certain amount of similarity to mine for me to find the character interesting. There are some books, The Great Gatsby, Mice and Men, Catcher in the Rye, where technically I can see the skill. They are well-written books. I definitely wouldn't challenge them being on school syllabuses as examples of someone who can write a book and of certain things. But the characters in them aren't interesting to me, not because they're not well-written characters, but because I don't really care about a bunch of shallow socialites or someone who's a little bit dodgy. And the same problem with Death of a Salesman, that it's a well-written story about a character I'm not interested in. And the fact it's well-written adds to the strength with which I don't go out of my way to read it. They've created something that isn't interesting to me. So I think interesting characters are a separate thing from well-written characters.
Most characters, I would say, are good guys. Most point of view characters.
Yeah.
But I do find characters like Holden Caulfield or whatever interesting. I would say that the socialites thing is because they're into something that I don't care about. I mean, I read Catcher in the Rye as an adult, not as a teen, so I read it and thought, what an obnoxious youth.
Yeah.
But I still enjoyed the story. So I don't know, it's a difficult thing. So I read The Game, which is not fiction, but it's narrative nonfiction. And all the people in that are horrible, reprehensible people. Even the author himself is kind of not great. I mean, he's using women for sex. But seeing that side of humanity is interesting for me, at least. That it doesn't have to be what I would do in a situation, as long as it's something that I believe a human being would do. Which is where bad guys often fall down, is that they're ridiculously mustache twirling bad guys. There's no reason for them to do it.
Yeah. Possibly that's the thing I mentioned about, for me, an interesting character has to be in an interesting world with an interesting plot. So if with some interest in each of those sectors, I could find a character interesting because they interact with an exciting plot. So possibly if Great Gatsby included a Death Star crashing into the swimming pool in chapter 3, and so suddenly you've got these socialites who are the same people I'm not really interested in their lives, who are now dealing with the fact there is an alien spaceship wedged in Jay Gatsby's back garden. They might become interesting characters then because of the way they interacted with this problem that was outside of their world. But for more introspective things like Death of a Salesman, The Great Gatsby, where it's about the character, if I'm not interested in celebrities, what is effectively a book about celebrities being celebrities and not being particularly happy about it, say, well, I already knew that celebrities probably aren't happy, shiny people all the time. So this plot doesn't make the characters interesting. The background, there isn't the contrast between the background and the character that makes it interesting for me. I mean, and to go to your point of reading Catcher in the Rye when you're an adult, I think it's the same. I've reviewed some young adult books, and my reviews have said I found the protagonist irritating rather than insightful. But then I'm not the target audience. There are some young adult books that are this real struggle for the protagonist to deal with an issue where when you're in your 30s or 40s and you've been working for ages, the problem doesn't seem that big and the answer doesn't seem that hard. And you've lost that sense of just how vitally important it is not to make a single social slip at school.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I have two 18-year-olds in the house, and the conflict between parents and children when they're teenagers is often that the parents think that it's inconsequential, whereas for the teenagers it's the most important thing possible. Because they haven't experienced anything deeper than the very, very shallow world of their social group in school, and the fact that someone's a noob or whatever, that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And it does take a decade or more to kind of get that perspective and realize, oh, well, that doesn't matter at all. If I don't like that guy, then I wouldn't hang out with him. So yeah, I mean, I find that a lot. But then there is young adult fiction where, like Hunger Games or Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I guess you could call young adult. It's not a book, obviously, but where things are a little bit deeper and you can get a lot out of it, even though they're teenagers.
I definitely can. I'm not saying I read a lot of young adult. I read a lot of everything. But I'm saying that sometimes it's about something that. See, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the main thrust is the chosen one fighting vampires. And if you were doing a elevator pitch for Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you wouldn't talk about the fact that she wasn't necessarily particularly happy with her mother. So that's in there, but that's not the primary thrust. Whereas for some young adult books, it's very much more about sort of grandma is starting to get old enough that sometimes she forgets things. So you've got to go over every day straight after final lesson at school to cook her tea for her. And that's horrible if you're 16. Having to leave school straight on the dot of last lesson and go over. And there will be other things in it as well, but it's fundamentally about that conflict between family duty and living your own life now that you're almost an adult. And so for me, Buffy the Vampire Slayer would be very much more interesting, even an episode about Buffy having to put things aside to look after her family, because it's not about the nuances of coping with that issue. That issue is another conflict that makes the main one trickier to resolve. So possibly interesting characters have to have a major conflict that interests you.
Yeah, I think it has to be a fundamental. So, so as a comparison, the Scream series that's been on MTV, and my wife and I watched the second season just last month, and there's a serial killer going around killing teenagers, and the teenagers are discussing who's going to the dance with who. And you're thinking, well, there's a serial killer going around killing you. Who cares who's going to the dance? That's not like. So there, for instance, the characters, the first question out of their mind should be, so when are we going to move? Like, there's a serial killer killing every teenager in this town. There should be no one there. It should be an empty town. after the cops failed to catch him for a week, everyone should be gone. Any parent who cares about their child would not send them to school when there's a killer killing them all. And the same thing happened in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but somehow it didn't. Like, if you're in Sunnydale, why the hell are you in Sunnydale? If you're a human, you should know that people get killed every 5 seconds, so leave.
Yeah.
But you kind of forgave it because that wasn't consistent. They did try and rationalize it and whatever, but it wasn't consistent. But there was enough there that you kind of forgave it. But when there's not, as you say, when the prime drive of the story is that who's going to the dance, then anyone over the age of 18 doesn't care who's going to the dance. They're interested in the serial killer stuff or vampires or whatever it is. And it makes no sense when there's a more kind of important thing to deal with. So yeah, I don't know. But as you say, like, if they a spoiler alert for Buffy, I guess, but they had an episode about, I'll try not to spoil it much. They had an episode about Buffy dealing with her relationship with her mother, and that was all it was about. It wasn't about vampires or anything in that particular episode. And it was, a good episode. I mean, a lot of people say it's one of their favorite episodes. So,
I saw a little, like, 5-minute short about NCIS where Mark Harmon was talking about that sort of thing. And he said that in series 3 and series 4 and so on, they started introducing episodes that are about the characters' backstories, and they didn't lose the audience with those, because for the first season they'd focused utterly on, we're a team of naval investigators with different skills. So by the time it came to sort of episode 3 of season 3, they'd earned the right with the audience to show these backstories. The people had got interested enough in the characters that they cared about this sort of thing. So they cared about a particular character having their father turn up, and the entire episode, their involvement is them trying to find out why their father has suddenly appeared and all of this kind of stuff. It's got nothing to do with investigating a crime. It's just personal problems, but they're interesting because we already know the character and we already know enough of what the character can do that you can have that character be mostly busy on something and then pop up, do their little thing. And that's okay if they just do their little thing, because we know they've proved over several seasons they can do this by actually laboriously doing it. So having them there to do the thing they need to do, or maybe you can do an entire episode where they don't have to be in it, but they are because they're dealing with this second plot, which is potentially another thing about interesting characters when you're writing them, that it's the order you get the information might make them interesting. Because Buffy's trouble with her mother, by the time you get to that episode, you're interested in Buffy for lots of reasons, and you're interested in Buffy's mother. So you've made the characters interesting to the audience, and then you have this thing. Whereas if it started in episode 1 with Buffy having problems with her mother, and she was fighting a vampire and having to deal with her mother, potentially it wouldn't be as interesting, because you don't really, well, in episode 1, you don't really care about any of the characters. You care about the premise.
I think another thing as well is the words that come out of a character's mouth. Their actions obviously speak for them, but the words that come out of their mouth should represent who they are as a person consistently. So Han Solo, for instance, is consistently selfish and a jackass and whatever in the first Star Wars, up until he changes his mind. If he halfway through had said, I really started to believe in this Force stuff and it's really cool and I've been reading a book about it, then it would have been not a great movie. And you have to kind of, like, so I was watching the first episode of Luke Cage, the new Netflix show, and there one character turns to the other and says, remember that time you were in prison and you did this and this and this? And then I was like, oh God, this is badly, this writer does not know what they're doing, because someone's buddy, like his friend, would not turn to him and go, remember that time you were in prison and you did this and this and this? Because of course he remembers, he was in prison. Like, you might say, remember that time you were drunk and you ran after the police or something, and maybe they wouldn't remember. But if they've been in prison for 6 years, I think they remember it.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's where Tarantino often gets his praise, is that his dialogue doesn't ever do that. His dialogue is like, so Tarantino and not Tarantino, John Travolta and Samuel L. Jackson in the car, just, they're buddies. They don't say, remember that time you were in prison and you, no, they're just talking about, hey, I was just in Paris and I saw what Whoppers are called in Paris or whatever. Which is what someone might actually say. Like, if they're just making small talk, they might actually say that.
Yeah.
But at the same time tells you these guys are buddies and they know each other, and that they've obviously worked together before, they're comfortable and all this kind of stuff. It just says it without saying it. Like, no one, like, John Travolta doesn't turn to him and say, we've been working together for a year now and I'm really comfortable with the way that we work together. No, they just have a normal conversation.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but that kind of consistency in character speaks well for the writer whenever I'm watching a show. When I watch a show and they're not telling me anything, they're kind of hinting. So I just watched the first episode of Westworld, and there's a few places where they kind of drift towards almost telling you, but they never do. They're always kind of hinting at things that are going on, which then makes me go, well, that's the series I'm going to watch, whereas Luke Cage is a series I'm going to drop. And I think it's something I haven't seen as much in books, is that kind of revealing through less kind of explicit dialogue, things about a character. And it's certainly something I've been thinking about this during the week as well, is that we now have the opportunity to elevate storytelling in general. There should be no reason why there's a bad TV show, because anyone who wants to be an author can write a book and can publish it and can get feedback and can get better and can keep writing books. And then if their ultimate goal is to write for television or movies, or write, the best book that's ever been written, whatever it happens to be, they have no excuse. There's no one blocking you. So when you had to go to a traditional publisher, there was someone blocking you and saying, this isn't good, but it's just a form letter, and it doesn't tell you what's wrong with it and why people wouldn't like it and all the rest of it. And I think it's only been going, 6 years since KDP launched, that there's an opportunity for storytelling in general to get a lot better than it has been in the past. And it's things like taking tips from people like Tarantino or whatever it happens to be, George R. Martin, all that kind of stuff will make everyone's storytelling better.
Yeah.
So characters especially, obviously, are kind of the crux of the story.
Mm.
And there should be no... I'm sure I've done this myself quite a lot, but there should be no point at which you sacrifice a character's intelligence in order to have a sword battle. That the characters... Like I was going to say about NCIS, I watched the NCIS for... I've said before, I hate crime shows, but I watched NCIS for like 13 seasons, which is quite a long time if you hate crime shows, because of the characters, because the characters were consistent and interesting, and that's why I watched a show where the format wasn't particularly interesting otherwise.
Yeah, there are a lot of that show, if you take it to its thing, that a team of specialists deal with crimes. The NCIS, CSI, other CSI, other CSI, yet another CSI. There are an awful lot of them, and some of them, like NCIS, they're great. And like you can go, I've got an hour, I'm feeling knackered, I just want to slump in front of the television with a sandwich and eat and have something to watch, so I'm just not staring at the sandwich. And you go NCIS, turn that on. But some of them, well, NCIS Cyber, am I going to like that? Do I want to try it or not? No, this isn't brilliant. So it's the characters that make the format. But also I think NCIS shows how it's the characters rather than one character. Where you read Conan stories. Conan stories are great. I love pulp fantasy. But most of the characters are very one-dimensional. And so Conan's great, but none of the other characters are. And Conan seems a little bit less great because he's not facing well-rounded characters. He's not interacting with well-rounded characters. And I've read most of the Conan stories more than once, and I can barely remember most of the characters in them. Which, given how much I remember things,
I would say that the Conan stories are one of the few cases where the movie far exceeds the books. Like I've read, I don't know, maybe 6 to 10 Conan stories, and just like you, I couldn't remember another character other than Conan. There was one where he was like a sergeant in the guard or something, and there was a captain he didn't like or something. I can barely remember it all. Yeah. Whereas in the movies, I could remember all of them because they all had cool stuff and they had character traits, and mostly they were cowards, but which kind of, that's another, like I was thinking about that earlier, that if you want to have a character who's essentially like a lead guitarist in a band, then you have to have the characters that support him as the bassist and the drummer and the whatever. Yeah. You can't have you can't have 6 people all doing a solo because it's just going to be a mess. Yeah. You have to have characters that complement the main character. So Conan is strong, kind of dumb and brave. So the characters around him tend to be smart and cowardly and not very strong. Yeah. And it kind of works that he's dragging them along by being very brave, and they're kind of reluctantly going along and giving their smarts to the whole situation. And that's a character where he tends, even in the books and the movies, tends to be pretty consistent. There was one book where he's up against some mage or something, And Conan is the ultimate, if you're a hammer, the entire world's a nail kind of thing.
Yeah.
He just wants to hit things with a sword or an axe or a club. He will not try and puzzle out whatever magician's puzzle. No, he'll just throw a sword at a mirror or whatever and hope that he gets it right. So yeah. Grant, was there anything you wanted to add at the end there, Dave?
I don't think so, no.
Cool. Well, thank you all very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.